Welcome to the Three Things Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, Director of Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You may be wondering why this podcast is called Three Things. You were probably taught by your parents, like I was, that it was impolite to talk to people about three things: religion, politics, and money. But what happens if your job is to talk about those three things? Well, let's find out. Welcome back to Three Things Podcast. With me is former ServiceMaster CEO Bill Pollard. So, Bill, when we spoke last, we talked a lot about your work at ServiceMaster. You were CEO twice. You were brought back after the CEO had a serious medical problem. We talked about how the current company has changed significantly. I would like to spend this session talking mainly about what you've learned as a leader, not just your business career or your legal career. And as you know, I teach college students. You and I have taught leadership courses in the past. So here's my question. What do you say to college students who are considering a career in the corporate world? What are the biggest temptations and what are the biggest rewards?
Well, I think when you say in the corporate world, you're talking about in a business that generates a profit, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And I think the biggest risk is that you get consumed with making money rather than leading and seeing that people grow in who they are, and yes, be exposed to God and the possibility of faith in God, and have that exposure such that it doesn't come across as preaching, but it comes across because of how people watch what you do, watch what you say, and what you care for and why. It doesn't mean that you don't say things at the appropriate time. You have to at certain times. But people are people. They've all been created in the image of God. Yes. They have a soul. And they're going to live forever. How are they going to be confronted? And you have a chance to speak to people that never will or never did cross the path of a church. So it's a mission field.
Yes.
And but at the same time, you don't have a basis for talking about your faith if you're not competent and successful in running a corporation and in producing profit for your shareholders.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question. I know you've been active in the Faith at Work movement. Can you tell us a little bit about what that movement is and why you back it?
Well, it is a movement now primarily among Christians, but it is a movement of introducing the whole question of taking faith out of the pew on Sunday and relating it to what you do during the week, and how you bring that faith into the work you do, whether that work is your family or whether work is something totally different. How do you integrate the faith with what you do? After all, there's only one day a week where you focus on it with respect to going to church, and there's 7 days a week. So what are you doing with your faith, and how do you introduce it into your work? And if you're in leadership position, one of the things you need to recognize at the front end is that you can't impose it. Mm-hmm. And you have to be very careful about the imposition of the faith. Especially, for example, I found when I was dealing with my friends in China or in the Far East, I couldn't come across as I had all the answers about faith. They have a whole different pattern of faith. Yet I could talk about what are the results of applying their views of faith to their life. And here are the results of applying my belief. One of our fast-growing businesses was in Japan. And we had to face it head-on in Japan in a variety of different ways. But it was always there. And it was always there because those objectives were always there.
That's really fascinating, given the Japanese history with Christianity. As you're well aware of, Christianity was flourishing until, I think, the early 1700s, when there was significant persecution and the church went deeply underground and has not recovered like it has in other places. But so regarding faith at work, do you think it's helped reduce the notion, in my view, the mistaken notion that there's secular work and there's sacred work, that now there's a greater realization that all work is sacred?
Yes, although I would not use that. All work is important. And if you look at work as a vehicle of relating with others, it gives a wonderful place to relate your faith.
Yes.
And your work also is, whatever it is contributing to the kind of person you are and who you're becoming. And I've had some good discussions with pastors on this question, both in my desire to encourage them to think more about talking about work and what the people are facing on Monday morning as part of developing their sermons. And they ought to have times in their life when they interject themselves into what the work environment is really like. If you are in a business, in a school, public school, or in some other type of environment like that, that doesn't have the emphasis of our faith, but yet has people.
Yes.
And people are part of our faith.
Absolutely.
Because they've all been created in the image and likeness of God.
So you've written a lot of books. If you could write one more book, what would it be about?
That's a great question. It's not easy for me to write a book. I don't necessarily enjoy it. I've done it, but I haven't thought about the next book, frankly, David. I think something along the line that maybe the primary reader would be a Christian, and recognizing in the process their responsibility to the world that God so loved. John 3:16.
Yes. Which makes me think of Billy Graham and the incredible work he did on a global basis. You served on his board. Can you tell us a little bit about your friendship with Billy Graham?
Yes, it was a special opportunity to work with him. It started when I was here working at the college, and he was on the board of Wheaton College.
That's right.
And so as I made presentations to the board, and he got to know me, and I got to know him. And then, as I left the college, went to ServiceMaster, he contacted me and said, "Would you be willing to serve on my board?" Mm-hmm. And that's how that whole process occurred. But one of the things I learned from him, well, not one of the things, I learned many things watching his life and listening to him in a non-preaching context, is his genuine care for people. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it was there, obviously, in his ministry and his preaching, but it was there in his life. And the people who worked with him in the Billy Graham Association, almost all of them would say that he cared for them as people, individuals. I've got I don't have it here. I have it up at Wisconsin, but I have a picture of Billy and me where I was leaning over, touching him, and he was sitting in a wheelchair. And it was a great memory. It represents a great memory of the man. And I also brought a book that you ought to get. It's my only one, so I'm not going to give it to you.
That's fair.
But it's his last book, and it's titled "Where I Am." Heaven,
yes.
Eternity in our life beyond. And it's obviously what he was thinking about in the last years of his life, but it's full of scripture dealing with what we know and can know about what life is going to be when we pass. And it's a very, very, very significant book.
Well, do you have any other suggested books or maybe some scripture verses you'd recommend to the listeners?
Well, I mentioned to you a little earlier in these sessions the new book on ServiceMaster by Al Earsman. And Al's a professor out at Seattle Pacific that gives you a good perspective of the company and also what the changes at the end in the company too. So that's a book I would suggest.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful. Looking back on your career, mainly your business career, do you believe you've accomplished what God had set out for you to accomplish?
Well, that's a good question, David. I obviously did a lot of different things.
Yes, you did.
I thought I had found my way when I decided to be a lawyer. I can tell you that each change that I made in my life, as I look back, I can see it was God's hand in helping me understand another dimension of life that He wanted me to be involved in. We haven't talked much about family, but family has been a very important part in my life, and I attribute that initially to my wife.
Yes.
And she obviously has been, we've been married 61 years, and she's been a very important part of my life. We had 4 children, 15 grandchildren, and now we are at close to 8 great-grandchildren.
Oh,
we have 7 born and 1 on the way. So that family, we get together as a whole family once a year, and then independently. Now that you can't get everybody all together with a family like that often, but we're fortunate to have a place up in Lake Geneva, which they all use during the summer, and we have a chance to relate to our family there in a very special way. So families have been a very important part in our lives, and I give a great tribute to my wife, who put up with a lot of things as I was working and traveling and away from home, more than I was at home in some of those periods. She was always there. She was always praying for me. Yeah.
Which kind of leads to my next question. A lot of people talk about work-life balance and, how to balance your family needs with your work. How did you figure that out? It seemed like you had a lot of potential for, the business part of your life taking over, and yet you've been married 61 years. Your family is foundational to your life. How did you intentionally make that happen?
Well, I think Judy was the biggest part of that, because she was a constant reminder to me, because I could get consumed in the business very easily, and the business, especially as we expanded internationally. And I got permission from the board that when I traveled internationally, I could take Judy with me if she could go.
Oh, that's great.
I think the constant encouragement from her was most of the factors of my interacting with the family. And even now, when we get the whole family together, while I can interact with them, they interact with my wife easier.
I think that's true in lots of families, Bill.
Yeah.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall you saying that when you were in law school, she supported your efforts. She was working and you were at school.
It was interesting. We both went to Wheaton College, and by the end of our, it's really halfway through our third year, she really wanted to get married, and so we had a long discussion, and I said something to her. I said, okay, we'll get married at the end of our junior year, but I think I should finish, because I'm going to end up being responsible for supporting the family, and I think you ought to get a job. Mm-hmm. Now you can imagine her folks and how they reacted to that.
Oh, yes.
I'm thankful they were very understanding. She was understanding of it, and that's exactly what happened. She quit, and I finished the college, and then of all things, when I finishing Wheaton College, I was deciding to go to law school. So, but at least I could work at things better when I was in law school, because I could work at law firms downtown, and the school went to Northwestern. It was in close to the Loop there. But she loved to be a mother, and soon she didn't have to work outside the home, and was a principle of helping in raising our children. Yeah.
Just a couple more questions, and then we'll conclude. You've been all over the world on business trips. You've led a large corporation a couple times. Tell me your thoughts on the free market system, and is this, and kind of capitalism writ large. You hear a lot of criticism today that capitalism is not good, that the government ought to step in more. Can you just generally tell me your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, and of course, I've been immersed in it, so maybe I'm prejudiced when I say this, but the free market system works in generating profit, works in creating new efforts to benefit and sell products and serve people. And those are dynamics that keep working at changing for a positive. Now, at the same time, it's not perfect at all, because it can become consuming.
Yes.
And anybody successful in it can be taken up with it, and it can control their life and how they determine priorities and so forth. So it has a huge negative side as well. Thank you, David, for what you're doing and what you've brought to the college here, and with your experience and things before you came. It's been a great addition.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. Please pass our love and affection to Judy, and we will be in touch. Blessings on you and your family.
Thank you, David.
Bye now.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You can find us at wheaton.edu/FPE.